All right, let's dive into a really fascinating story. Imagine you go to vote in an election. You cast your ballot, only to find out it doesn't really matter. That is the exact question at the center of this incredible legal battle inside one homeowners association. And really, it's a fight that gets to the heart of what a vote even means in the first place.
You know, it almost sounds like a riddle, right? When is your vote not really your vote? Well, for one homeowner down in Arizona, this wasn't some thought experiment. This question turned into a very real, very public legal battle.
Okay, so this entire case really boils down to the difference between these two concepts. On one hand, you've got proxy voting. That's pretty straightforward. You authorize another person to vote for you. Simple enough. But on the other hand, there's delegate voting, where an elected representative votes on behalf of a whole group. Now, they sound kind of similar, don't they? But the big question is, in the eyes of the law, where is that line actually drawn?
So, let's get into it. This whole thing kicked off with one homeowner, a guy named Robert Garing, who decided to take on his entire HOA. Why? Because he was convinced their voting system was, at its core, completely deceptive. And here's the legal firepower he brought to the fight. Mr. Garing claimed that his HOA's election system was breaking a very specific Arizona state law, RS Section 33-1812, and that law flat out bans proxy voting in communities just like his.
And during his testimony, Garing really didn't mince words. He put it bluntly, a proxy is a proxy, whether it's a delegate proxy or an individual proxy. I mean, his argument was super simple. If someone else is casting a vote that's supposed to be yours, that's a proxy. End of story. And he argued it should be illegal.
Garing's whole point was that individual homeowners, people like him, were basically powerless, and he didn't just show up with an opinion. He brought the numbers to back it up. He pointed out that in the last election, and I'm quoting here, member votes do not determine the outcome. Why? Because a whopping 70% of all votes were cast by these super powerful voting members. And this chart right here shows you exactly what he was talking about. This is the breakdown from the August 2023 election. Look at that. Only about 21% of the votes came from individual members, like him. Meanwhile, a massive 70.3%, more than 2/3, were cast by this small group of voting members. I mean, that is a staggering imbalance of power.
Okay, and here's where it gets really, really concrete. This is a vote from his own neighborhood. Garing, listed here as candidate A, actually won the most votes from the individual homeowners. He got 19. But then, look over at the voting member votes column. He gets a big fat 0. Meanwhile, the other candidates who got fewer individual votes each got a massive block of 164 votes from that one single voting member. This, right here, is the system he was fighting against.
So, that looks like a pretty powerful case, right? But what was the HOA's side of the story? What was their defense? Well, it turns out they didn't call it proxy voting at all. Nope. They had a completely different name for their system. See, the HOA insisted this was not proxy voting. They called it a voting delegate system. And here's how it works according to them. All the homeowners in a given neighborhood elect one person, a voting member. That person then becomes a delegate, and they're the one who casts all the votes for that entire neighborhood.
And to make their point, their lawyer used an analogy that, we can all pretty much get. They compared their system to the U.S. House of Representatives. Think about it. You don't vote on every single bill yourself, right? No, you elect a representative, and they go to Washington to vote on your behalf. Same idea, they argued. So their entire defense really hinged on a few key differences. First, they said their voting members are elected by a group. It's a collective choice. A proxy, on the other hand, is appointed by just one individual. So they're saying this isn't about one person giving their vote away. They saw it as a totally legitimate form of corporate governance, not a voting workaround.
Okay, so you've got two completely different ways of looking at the exact same system. One side says it's illegal proxy voting. The other says it's a legitimate delegate system. So how on earth does a judge decide something like this? Well, it all came down to a single, super critical detail buried in the language of the law.
I'm not kidding. The entire decision from the administrative law judge hinged on the very precise wording of one single phrase in that Arizona law.
And here it is. This is the exact text from the statute. Now pay very close attention to the part in bold. Votes allocated to a unit may not be cast pursuant to a proxy. Those 4 words right there, votes allocated to a unit, that's the whole ballgame.
So here's the judge's logic, and it's a fascinating legal distinction. She found that in this specific HOA system,
votes are not actually allocated to a unit. Instead, the HOA's own governing documents say that the votes are allocated directly to the elected voting member for each neighborhood.
And because of that, since the votes weren't technically allocated to a unit in this election, the state's rule against proxy voting just didn't apply in the way Mr. Garing had argued. And just like that, the petition was denied.
So the case gets denied, really on what seems like a legal technicality. But what's the big takeaway here? What does a case like this really reveal about the power of an HOA and just how important the fine print in the law can be?
Well, in the final decision, the judge made the distinction absolutely crystal clear. She wrote, while proxy voting is explicitly prohibited under the Planned Community Act, the legislature made no such bar regarding delegate voting as a form of HOA governance. It's a subtle difference for sure, but a legally powerful one.
And all of this really leaves us with a final, pretty powerful thought. There is a very, very fine line between a system of representation and a system where you effectively lose your voice. What this case proves is that it all comes down to the specific rules. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Do you know what the rules say in your community?